we can now move to any questions you might have. Indeed, I'll have to do a bit of a mix, virtual and physical questions. Tanya, you requested the floor virtually. Is it okay if we maybe do a first round from participants in the room? And I think you were first, right? So 1, 2, 3, maybe. Yes, please. And in particular, for those in the room, if you could introduce yourself with name and organization. Thank you.
I'm Jonathan. I work for CSW. We're a human rights organization. I have a question about the single entry point complaint mechanism. Your report said that complaints had only been made on market access issues. I think you maybe just updated us that a complaint had formally been made in Peru as well. And the report did mention that pre-submission meetings had happened on other human rights complaints. I just wanted to ask your reflections on those meetings, and obviously without going into specifics, I'm sure, but whether any complaints have been made on human rights violations that were not strictly linked to labor and environment rights, which I think, depending on the FTA, is provided for example, the EU-Vietnam FTA. And second question, in the Ombudsman's report of July this year, I think a suggestion was made for a new and separate mechanism covering human rights violations, which would also provide for local stakeholders to also take part, so not only EU-based stakeholders. I just wanted to ask your thoughts on that mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. If you could maybe let Tanya Bustek ask her question, because I understand she has to leave shortly, and then we continue on the floor. Tanya.
Thank you very much, Annette. I hope you can hear me. Can you just give me a sign? Because I'm connecting from the phone.
Yes.
Annette, am I audible? Brilliant. Thank you very much. Good morning, Dini, and good morning to everyone. Actually, I'm here now at the second EU Parliamentary Partnership Assembly in London. So I think that fits in also very well into the presentation that Dini gave. I would like to thank you personally, but also the entire team for, I know the setting up of the report is always a huge challenge. Sometimes it is, of course, the question of what is missing, what is in there. But from our perspective, in particular, also from the ESC, I would like to thank you in particular that you have put a lot of effort to give visibility also to the DAGs. This was one of our key recommendations because in the initial reports, this was a bit lacking. So thank you very much also for highlighting the importance of the all DAGs meeting. I think also the acknowledgement is very much important, and hope also this is shared by the DAG members. And I hope that in the future, together with you and also with the DAG chairs and DAG members, we can further develop this format, which I think is very useful. I would have one remark and one question. The remark goes also to DAG, but linked to the UK. I understand, of course, we will have our first UK anniversary DAG at the end of November. And of course, this has not been fully covered yet in the timeline of your report. But nonetheless, I think it would be important to reflect for the next report how we've been doing with this first DAG covering an entire agreement. It's a learning curve for all of us, not just for the DAG members, but also for the Commission itself, how we work together, how we make sure that so the recommendations are also then picked up. But I think it is also important, I'd just like to have also an open and honest exchange, what is not working and how we can improve that. So maybe that in the next report, there is space to reflect that also a bit more broadly, because we have been very active in the first year of the UK DAG, also with our engagement with the Commission. And then I would like to ask a question, maybe that is also partly reflected by you highlighting the first TSD case. Of course, it is too premature to come to any findings, which I don't want to rush into, but I was wondering whether from that first filing of case, you already have taken some lessons learned about the application of the new operational guidelines, but also maybe where we still need to further improve, because I do understand from those who had put forward the case, there are still some open questions, whether the evidence is enough, who is collecting them. It's like also for the time frame, is there a back and forth? So it'd be very interesting. Maybe you could share some first assessment also from your side. And thank you very much for letting me skip the queue.
Thank you, Tanya. And if it's okay, we take a third question, maybe Pauline Bastidon, if you could indicate your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Pauline Bastidon from Spirit Europe. Enforcement and implementation of FTAs is obviously critical for us. As the report says, wine and spirits attract the biggest number of barriers alongside agri-food products. Well, I think that statement applied to the period from 2016 to 2020, but it's still very much true for the period after 2020, sadly. I will ask you four questions. There are four types of barriers that we identify, very long-standing ones, and you have quite a few in the report which are mentioned. Not all of them, but some of them certainly are, particularly when it comes to tax discrimination. Some barriers have been there for a very long time. What is your strategy to try to address these long-standing barriers when they've been there for years and years in some cases? Then the second type of barriers that we find can be very time-sensitive ones, either because it's not materialized yet, but we know it's coming very soon, or because, for instance, it's an import ban, which of course is a big issue. We have one at the moment, for instance, in Nepal, which has been flagged, by the way, with the single entry point. And for these type of issues, waiting 120 days is just not going to be appropriate, because if you do that, either it will resolve itself, which what was the point of engaging in the first place, or if it doesn't, then it joins the queue in terms of long-standing barriers that have to be resolved and which are much more difficult to get rid of. Obviously, if we can prevent barriers from arising, it's even better. That would be a third type. So there, I mean, sometimes indeed, as you said, litigation is not the only way. Prevention through regulatory dialogue and cooperation with third countries, but also through capacity building and soft diplomacy can be very helpful. So how do you foresee the collaboration with EU delegations and other services of the Commission to try to prevent barriers from arising, especially for agri-food and wine and spirits, which attract the biggest numbers of such barriers? And last but not least, you've mentioned, of course, that trade tensions are on the rise, as is weaponization of trades. Unfortunately, we know that only too well. We've been caught in a few of these disputes in the past. How can we better prevent tensions from flaring up and also anticipating potential tensions? And how can we prevent the return of old ones? And there, you know, I'm going to mention, of course, EU-US, and the fact that, while we're very grateful for the temporary suspension of the tariffs, one of the deadlines for steel and aluminium is end of next year, which will come very soon. And although we have more time for Airbus Boeing, it's still of concern if there is a change in administration in the US, for instance. So how do we better address these tensions, which mean that sectors not related to the core of the dispute or the problem get caught and somehow have to pay the price for it?
Thank you indeed. I give the floor to Denis. Next round of questions will start with Daniel Perez-Vega virtually, and then we'll take two more questions from the floor indeed. Thank you.
Okay, no, thanks for that. Look, let's start with the human rights and single entry point issue. So first of all, in terms of how we've been dealing with what comes in, we have, it is correct, one formal complaint, which again, the complainant has publicized. We talk about that with respect to labor conditions in Peru and Colombia in particular. We've had other representations which we decided, in a sense, ourselves to treat like a complaint. That is the case with human rights and Vietnam in particular. Rather, the issues that were raised around human rights and the implementation of the FTA with respect to Vietnam. As one stakeholder has actually made a number of representations to us very actively on this. I don't think it's, I'm not sure if that is public or not, if the letters have been made public. I'm looking at Peter to see how, how much I'm supposed to talk about the substance. But I'm happy to talk about the substance because we looked at this very carefully. There are several issues that have been raised with respect to Vietnam. Some which relates to concerns about human rights and the treatment of particular individuals in Vietnam, and this is an important issue that continues to be dealt with at EU level by the EU institutions, by the High Representative and Vice President of the Commission, Josep Borrell, and the External Action Service, because they have the competence for dealing with human rights issues directly. Another set of issues were raised with respect to the functioning of the FTA, and in particular with the situation with respect to the establishment of the Domestic Advisory Group in Vietnam and the issues around that, on participation, etc. Now, we've looked at those questions, and we've decided basically to treat this as a complaint, so treat it as if it was a formal complaint. And I've actually written a detailed reply to the stakeholder concerned on this particular issue to give our view of what we believe is the relation between the situation and the actual treaty obligations of Vietnam with respect to the establishment of the DAG and the composition of the DAG, and how we see this evolving going further. Now, we've considered that there is no breach of the treaty commitments in this particular situation. As a matter of fact, with respect to Vietnam, this issue of the civil society structure is very important to us. So there was a whole effort being done in 2021 in order to arrive at the proper establishment of the Vietnamese DAG. It was fairly hard going. It implied a lot of support, including via the EU delegation, to the Vietnamese side, and it enabled at least the first meeting of the DAGs and the first meeting of the TSD subcommittee under the agreement. We've now had a second one, where the director in charge in DG Trade was co-chairing in Hanoi this meeting in the middle of October. We think that slowly this issue is going in the right direction. Number of members of the DAG has been increased, and basically we think that there is more to be obtained in terms of setting up as best as possible the institutional structures under the treaty by cooperating with Vietnam rather than considering that they are in breach of their commitments under the treaty. That is the view that we are taking on this issue for the time being. Of course, we'll continue to review the evolution of the situation, but it is a bit distinct, and we try to separate these things, put them in the right boxes, from concerns about human rights cases as such, which, again, well, I mean, again, I'm not supposed to speak about that. It's not my brief, but I think are very real and are being followed actively by the competent parts of the EU institutions. So, again, we're trying to look in this case at the different aspects of the issue, some in part connected, but also in part distinct. On the question of whether we need to change the mechanism that we have in place to deal with the human rights dimension specifically, and again, there is a human rights dimension, of course, in a trade agreement, because some of the fundamental labor rights are human rights, very clearly. So this is where we see a link in the treaty itself, okay? And this is what we need to therefore properly deal with in terms of compliance, in our view, under the trade agreements. So there you're quite right that there is a discussion going on with the ombudswoman between us and her, or the Commission and her, on this issue. If I'm not mistaken, again, I look at my colleagues, I think we have not yet formally responded to the Ombudswoman, so therefore I can't anticipate on what the Commission formal response will be, because it's not Peter or myself that are responding to the Ombudswoman, it's the Commission as a college, which is, I think it's the President actually who responds. So I'm not going to anticipate in terms of what we're going to say in response to some of the suggestions that have been made by the Ombudswoman on these issues. I would just say that when it comes again to the question of whether some of the fundamental labor rights, which are human rights, are breached under the treaties, the single entry point is geared to dealing with this and will look at these issues again under the way in which we operate the single entry point, as it will look at other TSD related issues or GSP implementation issues. So there is no obstacle right now to these issues being channeled through the single entry point and dealt with, from our point of view, as a potential case of non-compliance with the agreement. On the issues about the DAGs. So first of all, I think we also agree with what Tanya was saying earlier in her intervention, that we see value in the all DAG meetings that have now taken place twice. I think we will institutionalize this. We will have this meeting at least once a year. I think there is value in the DAG community coming together and being able to also do a bit of benchmarking in terms of how the different DAGs operate under the different agreements. There is certainly things to be, best practices to be developed out of that. The different DAGs face different issues with respect to the interaction with civil society structures on the other side under the different agreements, because they're not set up in the same way in third countries. And that is something that we fundamentally cannot change, because the treaties themselves, the trade agreements, are not prescriptive on the way in which the other party to the treaty sets up its DAG. And there are certain, the treaty establishes a certain benchmark in terms of how the civil society structures operate under the agreement. That's the one thing that we are pushing in these agreements. But the treaty provisions are not invasive to the point of basically prescribing to each party, your DAG shall be established in the following manner with the following participation, etc. So we do have, therefore, on the other side, and we know that is the challenge that the EU DAGs face, different types of interlocutor, different types of civil society structure on the other side, which are not necessarily constructed the same way as the EU DAGs are constructed. Now, that doesn't make the life of the DAGs particularly easy. We know that, and therefore that's why I think bringing the DAGs together and dealing with some of these issues and us interacting with the DAGs in the way to understand the way they deal with these issues is very useful, and we can commit to continue to do this. I take also the point about the need to make sure that we cover properly the operation of the civil society structures in next year's report with respect to the implementation of the UK TCA. I think that's a fair point. It is correct that it is the first agreement where the DAGs have a responsibility to support the implementation of the entire agreement. If we have passage of some of the more recent agreements, and in particular the modernized agreement with Mexico, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that I will also apply to that particular agreement. So you're right that it does. It's a new development, so it requires us to reflect on how has it worked. What are the challenges associated with the DAGs covering the entirety of the agreement, and I think probably next year will be a good time in order to start drawing some lessons. It's a bit early. I understand that in May the UK DAG put a number of questions to the Commission. There's been engagement now in September, I think, on those questions. Hopefully that is the way in which we should continue to build our engagement with the DAG under the TCA. But I think we certainly have a good case for taking stock of this next year. With respect to taking stocks and drawing lessons from the first formal TSD complaint by CNV International, it's probably a bit early, frankly, to draw lessons from that, because again, we have not even at the stage where we have formed a view and responded to the complainant about the substance of the case. We will stick to the deadlines, the timeline, not the deadlines, the timelines that we have committed to in the TSD review for doing that. We will apply these timelines to this case. That means that before the end of the year, we will express a view back to the complainant about the substance of the case as we see it under the agreement. I think we will continue to interact with this complainant and with other putative complainants, and it's true there have been also informal contacts about other cases on TSD matters, and again to try to see how concretely the interaction with the SEP works. There are, of course, always questions about what is the level of evidence that one should bring, in which form, how, etc. There is back and forth, but the fact that there is back and forth under the SEP, I don't think is a problem. I think it's actually the way in which the SEP should operate. It is normal and it's good that we have this formalized structure of interaction with stakeholders that see a problem of compliance in a third country, and we're able to exchange as much as necessary to build up the case. The whole idea of the SEP is very simple. It's to say, look, we are asking stakeholders to help us, help them, by making an effort at the front end in order to structure the evidence that they bring forward about possible non-compliance. It's very important because what we do not want to do anymore, ever, is be in a situation where stakeholders raise issues in general terms, consider that they have raised properly an issue with the Commission and therefore expect action from the Commission, but the Commission on itself, not having been clear in the interaction with the stakeholder concerned, considers that, well, all this is very vague, we don't really have the basis to act, we don't know what to do with this representation, and therefore what happened in the past, let's be honest, it kind of lingered a bit. Each side was not clear what, the stakeholders were not clear what the Commission was going to be doing next, and the Commission was not sure whether the stakeholders were coming back with something else. Therefore, drift, nothing happens. That's the worst of all worlds, because the stakeholders are unhappy, rightly so, because they think the Commission is not doing anything, and the Commission is unhappy because the Commission says, well, look, these stakeholders are not serious, they're not bringing us something that we can actually action. That's exactly what the SEP is supposed to break in terms of dynamic. And if that has happened, if this is what is happening, then it's working, from my point of view. I think it is working in this way. So yes, it is asking some effort in terms of evidence gathering and evidence transmission from the stakeholders. But the quid pro quo is that in exchange of that, we commit to be more responsive. And we have clarified in the case of TSD complaints that we will do this in a particular manner and actually within a particular time frame of steps in order to give more certainty still to the stakeholders that we're not going to let their issue linger. That is the basic idea behind the SEP. Now, within that, it has to be flexible. It's not a straight jacket, the SEP. It's supposed to be a facilitator. It's not supposed to be a constraint. So there is a degree balance to be found between a structured process and at the same time sufficient flexibility to be able to interact with the SEP to try to get the thing moving. So it's really a question, for me, very much a question of common sense as well in the way we interact with stakeholders. So, and frankly, that's what I'm here to do. If it works, tell me. If it doesn't work, tell me too. Or just, send me an email, say, this is not working, we're not getting what we should be getting from the Commission, etc. My colleagues from the SEP who are sitting here are not very happy about that particular part of the conversation. It doesn't matter. I mean, let's have it out in the open between us. That very much focused on the TSD aspect of things. On the market access issues, Pauline, that you were raising, so these are all actually very important points. You're quite right that there is an issue. In some cases, we have a long-standing barriers. Some of them actually being, let's be honest, being actually clear discriminatory measures. which are there and which have been there for a long time. If they're discriminatory, in all likelihood, they are a breach of commitment under the treaty, because that's what the trade treaty does basically at its core. It says, thou shalt not discriminate against that trading partner. I kind of explained this in many different ways in thousands of pages and schedules, but effectively that's what the trade treaty does, right? I know that there are a number of issues, for example, Central America or the Andean region in your sector where we have long-standing issues. I don't have an easy response to this, because we still think that we should try to solve these issues as part of the overall relationship without necessarily going systematically to a dispute, for example, in the WTO or under the bilateral dispute settlement framework. Why? Because dispute, risks taking a lot of time for something that perhaps can still be dealt with, even though it's been there for a long time, differently. So I think we need to come back to some of these issues. We need to maximize the use of the moments of engagement that we have with these countries. Use in particular political capital on these issues where necessary. There's relatively small, frankly, in terms of market access value, but of course for the sector they're not unimportant. So therefore, I think we must put some more. We need to put some more money in the machine, probably, on these issues. That is really the best answer I can give you on these questions. In some cases where we have a clear breach which is long-standing, we should consider probably taking the matter to dispute as well. That's not ruled out in any ways. Some cases, for all kinds of reasons, even on issues which are not necessarily big in economic terms, but where we see a clear legal breach, and also sometimes a systemic consideration that really needs to be tackled, we take matters to the WTO. We went to the WTO. I mentioned it earlier on an anti-dumping measure against EU exports. We don't do this for every anti-dumping measure that we consider in third countries to be disproportionate, or excessive, or not properly justified, because not all jurisdictions apply their trade defense legislation in the same pure, structured, and rules-based way that we do. But in some cases, we take these kinds of cases. So we need to look at this, and again, this will depend on what we think we can achieve with what tool at a particular point in time. For me, the question of barriers it's not a fixed menu. It's depending on the type of problem, the particular context in the third country at the moment in time, the kind of relationship that we have at that point in time with the country, across the trade relationship, but beyond the trade relationship, then we can press on different buttons. And we have to make sure that at any point in time, we press on the button that's the most efficient one. And it may not be the same one every time. In some cases, it might be taking a legal enforcement action. In some cases, it might be about finding, frankly, a fix with the third country concern. But you're right that we have to deal with the time-sensitive cases. And the example you gave of the import ban is very interesting, because actually over the last 2 years, we've seen a lot of such measures in all kinds of sectors. You were mentioning Nepal, in some agricultural areas as well, import ban on sugar in Egypt. There's a whole host of such measures that we had. In particular, when we saw a lot of very hard stops of trade around the time of the COVID pandemic, which was also a kind of confusion between COVID-related measures sometimes and hard market access disruptions. There, we will not wait for we will not deal with this, mechanically by saying, "Oh, we'll only come back to you after 120 days." There, when we have a measure like an import ban, we try to spring ourselves into action as soon as possible, immediately. And actually, in some cases, we will do this, of course, even ex officio. We don't need a complaint necessarily to deal with an import ban, especially if it's very broad and very wide. I think that we have been able to solve some of these kind of time-sensitive measures. And we did, at the end of the day, manage to lift some of the import bans that we saw, in particular in the southern neighborhood in 2020, 2021. Was it quick enough? It does damage, because as soon as you have a disruption of traditional trade flows, it's quite difficult sometimes to recoup. So we understand the time-sensitive nature of that. Then there are more longer-term things, and what you say about cooperation and capacity building, I think, is very relevant for the TBT type barriers, the regulatory standards type barriers, because there, probably, because we have sophisticated regulatory frameworks in place in the EU and some sectoral areas, that's the case for wine, for example. I mean, you know, in the EU, we have a wine industry, we have standards, we have practices, we have regulatory frameworks that are quite good, because we're kind of, you know, we're a trading bloc where this is a sector which is strong. There is certainly a case for us to work together with industry to try to project these our domestic regulatory frameworks, and try to, I wouldn't say export them, but emulate the third countries to take inspiration from them. Because the more they converge towards our approaches in terms of standards, in terms of regulation, the less we're going to have market access problems further down the line. And that requires something which is very complicated to do, which is international regulatory cooperation. International regulatory cooperation is a part of a strategy for dealing with trade tensions, market access issues, etc. It's the thing that you do en amont, right? Are we doing this enough? Again, industry by industry, sector by sector, in particular for the big exporting sectors. Let's look at whether what we do out of the public authorities can actually be mutually supportive with what industry is doing, including industry to industry, because I think a lot can be done by industry to industry cooperation. But then maybe the Commission, other regulatory agencies can come and support this. But again, for that, we need to build a bit of a strategy. I think, for example, in the wine sector, this is certainly something that's already happening, but perhaps there is more to be done. Interested to pursue that conversation if you want. Yeah, and on trade tensions, avoiding flare-up, it is very important. We have the tools for engagement to avoid that happening. With respect to the US, we have indeed parked a number of disputes that indeed were affecting sectors, including sectors not directly linked to the dispute. I'm thinking about the large civil aircraft dispute and the countermeasures associated with this, impacting in particular your sector. But that's why we have, in the way we have dealt with the suspension of these disputes, we have put in place the frameworks in order to continue to work towards a long-term resolution of these disputes, work under the agreement on large civil aircraft, work towards a global steel arrangement with respect to the steel and aluminium dispute, and maximizing the use of the structure that we have in place with the Trade and Technology Council, precisely to be something which is a tool to avoid trade tensions further down the line by working towards a greater convergence, in particular in the development of big regulatory frameworks for the digital economy, for the transition, between us and the United States. Now, there are challenges. The recent adoption of the Inflation Reduction Act and what it represents is a challenge and is potentially a source of problems and risks further down the line in terms of transatlantic tensions. I mean, I think we are very clear on this. But it doesn't mean that it invalidates the work that is taking place under the existing structures, which precisely are there to avoid the re-emergence of these legacy issues. But I can, if you want, confirm to you that a lot of attention is being given by us in the next year or so to make sure that we do not end up with a resurrection of those legacy disputes.
Good, thank you indeed. So next is indeed Daniel Perez-Vega from Eurogroup for Animals Virtual, and then I had several questions from the floor. Indeed, we take two at least here. So overall, we have half an hour to go, and we have at least 6 questions. So if everyone could try to be as concise as possible, so that
That applies to me too.
everyone collectively.
No, but for me it's a ploy because if I reply at length, then I answer fewer questions. You understand that?
Otherwise, we
Boss?
take 5 in a bunch.
You understand that that's my tactics.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for giving me the floor. My name is Daniel Perez-Vega, and I work for Eurogroup for Animals, the European Federation of Animal Welfare Organizations. First of all, thank you for the presentation of the report and for the efforts of including in the report the role of DAGs and a mention to animal welfare. I'd like to start with a comment and perhaps already a disagreement, and that is that as far as animal welfare is concerned, at the moment, cooperation FTAs are not the best tool we have to engage with partners. And that is because the language in those cooperations is often non-committal and commitments are very often aspirational. But as the report mentions a cooperation with Canada on animal welfare, I have a question about that. Last year, the Commission was exploring topics of discussion to propose to Canadian counterparts, and we suggested a few topics. For example, issues relating to horse welfare and related horse meat imports from Canada, where according to many investigations and audits from the EU, there are significant shortcomings in terms of traceability in the production chains. So it is my understanding that this topic is being discussed in the context of the Regulatory Cooperation Forum. So can you please give us some information on where we stand on this cooperation at the moment? And perhaps a word or two about other cooperation that are not mentioned in the report, but I hope are nevertheless advancing, such as the one with Vietnam and Japan. So being short, just an encouragement to the Commission to continue developing cooperation with partners, and happy, of course, to follow up with you on these cooperations. Many thanks.
Thank you indeed. Harald Past, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Harald Past from Eurocommerce. We appreciate the comprehensive report, and we definitely also support the Commission in its efforts to ensure proper implementation of the existing FTAs. Now on this, we see there is still room for maneuver to bring FTAs to their full potential. So most recent figures I have seen is that the average utilization rate of trade preferences in general is about 67%. Of course, there are some differences for importers and exporters. So the reasons for that are, of course, manifold, but I think 2 major reasons are first, probably the lack of awareness of the agreements, especially for smaller enterprises, but also the bureaucracy companies are facing, unnecessary burdens in dealing with rules of origin, for example. Now, I would like to ask if you could say some words on the developments on the utilization rate and any possible actions we can expect from the Commission side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm just going line by line. So if you could please, yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Alina Kala. I work for The London Story. We're also a human rights NGO. And I'm curious about the role of human rights and sustainability impact assessments. For instance, with the upcoming India FTA, there's now a new tender that's just been closed about a impact assessment, but the FTA is supposed to be concluded in about a year. So it's a bit odd to think about how the conclusions of the impact assessment will be incorporated in the TSD chapter. So more broadly, what are the ways in which these conclusions of the impact assessments are incorporated in the TSD chapter to make them as enforceable and as realistic as possible? Thank you.
Thank you indeed. So that was 3 questions. Denny.
So to Daniel on animal welfare, and by the way, I should say that I'm happy that we pick up a conversation because we had a detailed conversation on the priorities in these issues before the before the summer break, if I remember correctly, and it was very useful because you know, it was very clear. I said to you as a stakeholder, I said, look, let's prioritize. Let's talk about priorities, and you did that effort. As a stakeholder, you came, you tabled a number of priorities, and the ball is in our court to still follow up on some of these, by the way. And I'm very conscious of that, and I owe you the follow-up because you did the effort into prioritization. Now we've got to do the effort in terms of delivery. You raised some of the questions indeed that we had discussed in terms of priorities, issues in Vietnam, issues in Japan. I still need to follow up on some of these issues, in particular in relation with, or in articulation or with DG Sante, because as you know, some of these things are not just in the remit of DG Trade, but also require a bit of a whole of government action on our side. That's why it has taken a bit longer. You raised also issues with respect to Colombia. You remember that we took the commitment that we will raise the issues of the Colombia law, which is about banning animal testing for cosmetic production, and we raised this actively in the context of the institutional structures of the agreement. And we did this actually last month at the end of October in the EU Andean Community SPS committee. And I don't know whether you've been debriefed of those discussions by my colleagues since, but if not, I would encourage that this be the case, and I will actually ask the colleagues to liaise with you. So, you know, again, this is something which we had discussed in terms of your priorities. I said that there were a number of process commitments that we could take vis-à-vis those priorities. In this particular case, we have done that. I can't tell you right now what the outcome of that discussion with Colombia on the law for banning animal tests for cosmetics is, because I was not myself in the discussions of the SPS committee, and I don't remember the readout that I've seen of that, but I know that this was actively raised and discussed with the Colombian side. So maybe there is a follow-up to be done. With respect to Canada, in July, there were several issues that were discussed with Canada. The impacts on animal welfare, on a number of issues such as extreme weather diseases, the question of welfare of horses used for meat production, the transport and slaughter questions, as well as other animal welfare related issues. So this is something where there, again, we are using the agreement. Is it a problem that we have cooperation provisions in this agreement? Let's be clear that, you know my view on this, because we talked about this. So I don't think that the fact that cooperation provisions in trade agreements by definition are aspirational, non-committal, as you say, is in itself a fundamental problem. Because you cannot have prescriptive cooperation provisions in a trade agreement. It doesn't work. You can't force cooperation. Either you have a willingness by the parties to cooperate, or in whichever way you want to write up the commitment, it's not enforceable. You can't legally enforce non-cooperation. It takes two to tango, it takes two to cooperate, you need to want to cooperate. So the key, I can see you're not happy with this, but I fear that is the reality. The key, therefore, is to create the incentive for cooperation for the other party. And some are more inclined to that cooperation in this area than others, it's clear. But where we see some opening of the door, where we see some mutual interest, we got to try to prise the door open and stimulate the cooperation. So again, working with you to stimulate cooperation under the agreements, under the provisions that we have, which are cooperation agreements. We're not going to take, you know, a partner to bilateral dispute settlement on a cooperation provision. I doubt that. I mean, I've been working on enforcement for a long time. I can't see that happening. There's no good reasons for doing that. But it doesn't mean that the provision is ineffective. If we find the right issues at the right time, we can actually get things and results out of the cooperation provision. So I think it's more a question of again, defining priorities, defining incentives for the other side to cooperate in good faith and actively. And that's what I would propose that we focus on when it comes to the operation of cooperation provisions in our agreements more generally, by the way. It applies to animal welfare. It applies to a number of regulatory issues, which are cooperation provisions. There, again, the art is what do we inject, what kind of life do we inject in these provisions as parties to the treaty? But as parties to the treaties, backed and supported by you as stakeholders. That's what I think we should try to do. But on some of the cooperation issues with, again, Vietnam and Japan, I want to come back to you because this forms part of the priorities that you had expressed. And I don't think that we have, unless you tell me otherwise, by the way, if you've been in contact with the colleagues, with Luis and others in Unit D3, that we have given on 2 of the 3 issues for yet a follow-up to what we discussed earlier. On preference utilization rates. It's like the whole world preference utilization rates. Can I speak for an hour about preference? No, maybe not. No. Actually, maybe Geraldine also, you should speak about preference utilization rate because you've been working a lot on it. But just to say, I think on this. For me, we have to continue to look agreement by agreement, sector by sector, at this question of do we maximize the use of the agreement? So there's work that has gone into this. I don't know whether you want to elaborate a bit on what's being done in the expert, the group with member states on this. The studies are being made on this. It's necessary to be very granular because I think the causes are multiple. I mean, in some cases it's administrative. In some cases it has to do, frankly, with the level of preferences, and therefore you're not going to solve it. In some cases it's a time issue. I mean, it's true that with the more recent agreement with Vietnam, for example, the preference utilization rate is still very low, but that you can expect to see corrected over time. When I looked at the figures with Canada, it's a bit more worrying because it's been in place for a while now, the agreement with Canada. It's still relatively low, particularly on the export side. So I think I really think, but maybe you correct me, but I think the only way is to look at this very granularly with the sectors concerned, agreement by agreement.
Yes, indeed. So I couldn't agree more. Actually, with both person who asked the question and Denis. So what are we doing? We are collecting the information from the customs authorities every year, beginning of the year, from the partner countries, and we have managed to get data for a total of 39 FTA partners over 3 years now, from 2019 to 2021. And these are published not as part of the report because the figures come always a bit last minute, but they're published on a website. So, and what are we publishing them for? For sectors, as Denis mentioned, to look into how much have they saved and how much could they have saved if they had used the agreement to full extent. Now, obviously, that may not make sense in all cases. For instance, Singapore is such a case where most of the trade was already MFN 0 before the agreement entered into force. So we have a very low preference utilization rate, as you will see, but then this only concerns 0.1% of our trade and 4 tariff lines. In case of Canada, yes, indeed. So we are still in the low range on both sides, so for both the EU and Canada. What have we done? We certainly stepped up communication. The event that Denis mentioned is a case in point. We were celebrating the 5th anniversary. We also have a monthly exchange with the Global Affairs Canada on preference use. So we are watching this, and we are also engaging, as Denis said, sectors. So we invite you to bring forward new elements and to discuss with you in one of the market access working groups that focus on particular sectors. Now, Vietnam was mentioned there. Indeed, we are also stepping up efforts, and we have recently produced, I think it was in March of this year, an online guide for SMEs how to better use the agreement for both imports and exports. So we are working also under the support of an EU project to help SMEs take up the opportunities. Thank you.
And on the question of the sustainability impact assessment and the incorporation in the negotiations, I'm not really well placed actually to answer this question. Maybe this is something that I will relay back to the chief negotiator of the FTA, to Christoph Kiener. I mean, we have, and the fact that these come relatively late in the process is something that we've been concerned about. I know that there has been a big debate on this with respect to the conclusion of the Mercosur agreement. But I think we do want to make sure that the sustainability impact assessment inform the negotiations themselves. That's difficult. I mean, they do at different levels. I think they have done in the past on different agreements in different manner. I'm not, again, I don't deal with the negotiation side. So I think on this specific question of how we will build in the SIA with respect to the India negotiation, I think we should come back to you with a more informed reply on this. I think there was a CSD meeting on India in July, but with Christoph, I guess. But feel free to come back to him on this question. And sorry for not being more helpful there.
Good, thank you. We have 2 more questions virtual, and then we could take, I think we can take 1 more round of questions. I'll try to slip in as many as possible. To start with a private question that came from MedTech, which is about the additional guidelines to be expected as per Article 12 from the procurement instrument, from the IPI. When can we expect those, and what can we expect those to cover? First question, and then I take 2 more questions from the floor, maybe Virginia and your colleague in the row behind. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me the floor, and thanks, Mr. Radonet, for the presentation. I'm Virginia Ensley from the Fair Trade Advocacy Office. I have 2 questions and 2 remarks. The first question is that the report refers to improve respect of labor standards in the EU-Andean countries agreement, but the Andean DACs are reporting that that is certainly not the case. That was informed in one of the last meetings of the Andean DACs that took place in end of October. So the question is, with whom is the Commission interacting with regards to the effective implementation of labor rights, and or how is the evidence being gathered to report on implementation of labor rights? The affirmation included in the report is also striking, considering the TSD complaint introduced against Colombia and Peru. The second question is regarding the follow-up of the Cocoa Talks. There is a brief reference to that in the report. And there are some calls to renegotiate the economic partnership agreement and or to introduce a TSD chapter on it. So perhaps my question is if do you have any insights into that? And finally, the 2 remarks. The first one is that perhaps for the future, there could be a more detailed report, particularly or only on the implementation of TSD chapters, especially looking into the future implementation of the trade agreements that are in the making and that may raise, they're already raising issues of sustainability and in the future should maintain. Particularly interesting, at least for us, would be to report on the implementation of the commitment to promote fair and ethical schemes. And the last remark is taking up on something that you respond to, Daniel, that you just referred to the willingness to cooperate and the incentives to cooperate within trade agreements. But I would like to highlight that, for instance, in the TSD review, civil society organizations were calling for the introduction of different tariff differentiation for sustainable production, and that was finally not included. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm well aware that there are more requests for the floor, including one online from Pascal Rouillet. I've noted that down, but I think we have only time for one last question, and then I would indeed very much invite those who couldn't ask their question to send them in writing, and we would do our best to reply indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your, let's say, lively presentation and also insightful report, and thank you to your team on that regard. My name is Bjorn Soyer. I'm working for the Federation of Belgian Enterprises, and I have many questions, but I will restrain myself to one, which is regarding to the EU toolbox of autonomous trade-related instruments, but in the sustainability strand. Because you presented it for the assertiveness strand, but you didn't hint at key initiatives like ban on forced labor, deforestation, not to mention due diligence. And on that regard, implementation and enforcement have been consistently pointed out in the Parliament as the crux of the matter. And so my question is therefore threefold. How do you assess first the role of your team on those initiatives? How do you assess the cooperation with third countries which don't have the same capacity or political will as the EU? And third, how do you assess the EU ability to enforce sanction on those initiatives to country, for example, let's say to country like, let's say, China, for example? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denis.
Okay, on the IPI and the guidelines, I think we are not committing yet in terms of timing, in terms of how we further elaborate on how we're going to move to the implementation phase of the agreement. I think what we want to do is we want to work with some of the key sectors which suffer from a problem of non-reciprocity in procurement. And that indeed can include the medical device sector, to look, before we get into the question of whether we would actually activate formally or initiate under the instrument, to look at sectorally at the situation in key jurisdictions and look at specifically at this extent of lack of reciprocity. So I think we should think in the next few months about working with, I think, with you, MedTech, and medical devices sector, and other sectors, some of them are well identified, first to try to build up, I think, the picture of non-reciprocity in some key jurisdictions, or a bit of a kind of the equivalent, if you want, of a sectoral inquiry. That's what I think we're going to try to do short term, and then we will see whether we trigger the IPI legally as such or not, and whether we do this on the basis of complaints or whether we do this on an ex officio basis, the two possibilities being there. With respect to some of the points that you raised on fair trade, but also more generally on the question of labor rights in Andean. So you are right that there are a lot of issues with the jurisdictions concerned on labor rights in Peru, in Colombia, in Ecuador, in the banana sector. Some of them have been long-standing issues. In the past, we had derived, together with the partners, under the structures of the agreement, some, I would say roadmap, but elements of programming of certain actions. I think we have at every point, and certainly when we have the meeting of the committees under the agreement, to take stock of what that is producing, what that is not producing. If you think we are too positive in this respect in our reporting, I'm happy to take that point on board. I mean, I'm aware of the extent of the issues that are faced there by various constituencies. And it's not a surprise that this is in this region that we also have a formal complaint under the SEP. But I think, again, the question there will be, first and foremost, starting with cooperation. How much is that cooperation in the field, in country, producing in terms of changes on the ground, and where is it falling short of actually producing change? And that's something which cannot be discussed in the abstract. I mean, we've got to look sector by sector, a type of distortion or problem that we see, and then try to reflect that as much as possible, and use the civil society structures and their engagement to that effect. I think I mean I think myself, colleagues on the sustainable development side are happy to try to have any discussion or follow up of these meetings that took place at the end of October, as the different stakeholders see fit. Let's have those discussions and let's unpack what happened there, what we heard from the Colombian government, the Peruvian government, in the context of the TSD subcommittee, and discuss that. On future, on what pertains to the negotiation of future provisions, future agreements, I'll not go into this because, as you know, I deal with the things that are on the books. I'm not responsible for the negotiation side of the House, so there I will sheepishly kick that one in the long grass, which is a bit unfair, but I think that it's probably better I don't necessarily that I don't talk about where we go next in terms of future TSD chapters and future agreements. I mean, I think we've had discussion about it. We'll continue to have discussion about this because this is a part of the rollout, of course, of the TSD review, which, as you said, contains certain things. There are things we took on board, things we did not take on board. And in the TSD review, I think we try to identify things that are going to require changes, notably in future agreements and future negotiations, and things that we can do more and better on the basis of existing agreements. And I'm if you want, because of my role, I'm more focused on the latter than on the former. On the question of more reporting on the implementation of the TSD chapters in the report, that is indeed something we're going to be thinking about the structure of next year's report. You make the point about the question of the coverage of fair trade. I think we should. We're going to reflect a bit on how we balance. I think the content and the nature of the information. Do you want to?
Just point out that we have a section within the section 2 on FTA implementation, making the most of our agreements. We put the section C on TSD there because we're talking about the implementation of binding commitments in FTAs. So this is where you find the information on TSD. And obviously, please also consult the staff working document, which has individual agreements covered, 38 of them for major FTAs. And there's also a specific point referring to progress, but also challenges in implementing and enforcing TSD commitments.
On the question of the autonomous instruments that relate to sustainability, so which by the way, are not necessarily on the books yet. Forced labor, deforestation, due diligence legislation to be implemented nationally. You are absolutely right that the implementation of this is what matters, and the capacity to properly implement these statutes. Now there, of course, it depends, because in some cases, implementation will be the responsibility of the national level. Look at the forced labor proposal. That is what we are foreseeing, right? In some other cases, there's a role for implementation more directly at EU level. So first of all, the differences between the different instruments. Second, I think you are very right to highlight the question of capacity to meet those obligations in third countries. And the question of the time that we have between the proposal on these instruments and the effective entry into force is one where we should also put a greater effort at engagement with third countries to help the preparation of entry into force, not just on our side, but also on their side, for those that will be particularly affected in their trade with the EU. So the whole question of regulatory cooperation matters here with respect to the proper implementation further down the road of the autonomous instruments. And third, I think there is a real challenge. I think we are there. This is at least my personal view, is that there is a real challenge because controlling through trade, in our trade, production methods is much more difficult, of course, than controlling the characteristics of the products. Even that, by the way, in terms of controlling imports on product safety, etc., is not easy or straightforward now, because the systems that we have in place in the EU for market surveillance are constrained in terms of capacity. Now, it's a much bigger challenge when it comes to controlling production methods and standards. So it requires probably for us in the next few years a whole gearing up of the agencies that will participate in this, whether it's customs, whether it's SPS, in a very sort of granular manner in terms of resources, I think. I don't have, I mean, so it's not something that concerns DG Trade only. It's a much broader challenge of the operation of government and the government agencies that operate, I would say, at the border for things that relate to what happens behind the border. But that, I think, is certainly a challenge that has to be, that the legislators in particular have to be very careful about when they set up these new statutes. So it's a long, we're in this for the long haul, I think, on this question.
Thank you, Denis. Excellent. So indeed, I can only reiterate our happiness to receive any questions that could not be taken in writing. I guess probably best to the functional mailbox, and we will then indeed respond in writing as well.
And I also was going to say maybe that, you know, above and beyond the written questions, I mean, and I'm sorry that because I spoke at great length, I probably don't allow many of you to ask questions, but as CTO, I'm available basically for stakeholders, for the domestic constituencies. I mean, so if you want to discuss issues, you basically ring at the door, and that's my job basically, is to be a go-to person for the stakeholder, domestic stakeholder community. That's why I end up not having enough time speaking to third countries, because I speak to us first. But that's part of the job. So it's part of my job, it's part of the job of the SEP. So don't hesitate to proactively come and raise the issues, whether it's market access, whether it's sustainability related issues under our agreements, with me directly. That's what I'm here for, and I encourage you to do that.
Very good. So otherwise we come to the conclusion of this meeting, unless you have any further concluding remarks, Denis, which of course you could, you're happy to say. I would just want to remind of the next civil society dialogue meetings that are coming up, in particular one still this week on our trade negotiations with Australia on Thursday, and then we have another one which falls into Denis' remit, but it will not be with Denis himself, on trade defense instruments, the annual report, which is on the 24th of November. We will normally continue these civil society dialogues in a virtual format, only select ones which are considered to be of more importance, like the one today, where we have indeed the Chief Trade Enforcement Officer or DG or our EVP, will be held in a hybrid format, but otherwise we will continue for the rest virtually. Thank you very much indeed, Denis. I think that concludes today's discussion. Thank you very much indeed, in particular to those who came in person. Excellent.